Sweeney and she's young and blonde and blue-eyed. Holy smoke, like, how do you make this go viral?
John Evans has been in the room when the biggest marketing decisions have been made.
Jaguar's a fault line in marketing. What I mean by that,
He's won awards while at the world's biggest brands,
so most rebrands don't work.
like Pepsi, Mountain Dew and Gatorade.
Oh, suddenly no one's going to drink the beer anymore, and therefore...
And when he became the first chief marketing officer at BrewDog,
This is where... Now, this is quite a funny one because...
he was fired after 3 months for being too honest.
It's a bit like why Boris got away with stuff, right? The thing with Ryanair that people don't understand is... So I think the challenge for Apple from a marketing perspective is...
This is John Evans, Uncensored. Make sure you subscribe so we can continue to get bigger and bigger guests. John, welcome to Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. How do you introduce yourself at parties?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, a number of different ways. I mean, I sometimes use my daughter's phrase, which is when my daughter was 5. She said, "Daddy, can you explain what you do?" And I spent about 15 minutes basically kind of explaining what marketing is to her. And she goes, "So you do the cutting, the sticking and the colouring in, do you?" Which has kind of stuck ever since. So it's either that or chief marketing officer, which are kind of the American phrase. Or more normally now I just go, I host a podcast, because most people listen to podcasts and know what that is. And that's far more attractive than I work in advertising and marketing. Because when you say advertising and marketing, most people think you did the fly that's stuck on someone's windscreen outside, you know, or they decide to moan about the direct mail they got or when they had a bad customer service experience. So I disassociate myself from all that and focus on something more interesting.
And you started the podcast really quite early, right?
Early-ish, although I say early. This was 2018.
Okay.
And actually, I thought I was late. Because at the time, I remember people saying to me, "Does the world need another marketing podcast?" And I got that feedback. And at the time, there were probably 500 or 600 other marketing podcasts. And I'm like, well, why should I exist in amongst these? But I started listening to a few and I got bored, honestly, man. And also what I realized is most people doing marketing podcasts had never done marketing. They were journalists or they're doing it as a hobby.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I've done marketing. I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. And I thought I'd give it a go.
Well, we'll come back to the podcast because it's interesting. I did mine 5 years ago and I also thought I was potentially a bit late and so on. But how did you end up in marketing? What was your career journey there?
I got a very odd career journey because originally I started in finance, right? So I did economics and finance for my degree. I went to work in the city. I was on the trading floor of an investment bank, did that for about 6 months and got bored really, really quickly. And I decided in a kind of a weird epiphany that rather than count the money, I wanted to make the money. And I was like, which department in a company is responsible for inventing the future? So rather than account for the past, I wanted to kind of create the future. And I reckon that marketing was the closest you could get to thinking about what happens next. And I had to make a bit of a pivot because obviously I'd got an economics and finance degree. I'd worked at that point, I'd done 6 months at a accountancy firm and 6 months at a merchant bank. So obviously not very long career in finance, but it started it out. And then managed to...
But it's still quite hard to pivot though, I presume, right? Because I had this when I'd left Number 10, people looked at my degree and everything that I'd done, and they were like, well, you politics, that you're going to do lobbying and public affairs. And it's like, no one could look at me and think of what else I could do. Like, companies are quite like, well, that's your skill set. That's the box we need to fill. That's where you're going. Like, it's just
very, very hard. I had this for a few years, even when I worked technically in marketing. So my pivot was basically to move in a number of jumps, right? So I applied for a job at a big soft drink company called Britvic, and they had a job going for a market analyst. Now, of course, market analyst is a fairly, data numbers-based role. And I thought, well, I tell you what, if I start there, maybe I can convince them of my creative skills and gradually edge myself to the marketing department. So I did a series of little jumps. So I worked in trade marketing, which is a more serious end of marketing where you're dealing with customers all the time. And then brand marketing after that, which is the more exciting kind of future focusing. So it took me 4 or 5 years, I'd say, until I was in the job that I wanted.
And what was your process like for sort of working that out then when you were like, okay, I want to move more from finance to the marketing side? Like, how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, the first point was realizing I was in the wrong job, right? So I was, I can tell you precisely the moment. So I was working at Cooperson Light Brand, and I was in the tax department of all places, right? So fairly kind of grown-up job. And I was doing the tax return of this guy. And what I discovered as I was interviewing him about his tax affairs is that what he was doing in his job was way more interesting than what I was doing in my job. You know, and I just said to him at the end, I said, look, here's your tax return, and well done. But out of interest, what do you do? Because I love the sound of where you're going and what you're talking about and so on. And he was a marketing director for a big UK company, and we just chatted kind of for a little while. And I thought, that sounds like the career I knew I wanted but didn't know existed.
Yes.
And this is the problem that growing up as I did in the 80s, everyone had to be a function. Like I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon, I'm an accountant, or a politician. But marketing was not a career that anyone ever suggested you go into. So I didn't know that thing existed. And when I met someone who did it, I'm like, that sounds like what I could do.
And what would your advice be to somebody now wanting to kind of break into marketing and so on? Because you're right, it's a career that I didn't realise kind of existed. Not many people doing sort of marketing in the East Midlands. I guess at a sort of high level, often kind of quite a London-based job, I imagine. Not entirely, but yeah. What would your advice be to somebody wanting to break into marketing?
Well, the first thing I think with marketing is to understand what it is, because the thing with marketing is that most people shortcut it to advertising, because the bit that most people see is the bit you might see on TV or in your feed, right? So they default to that. Advertising is probably about 5 or 10% of a typical marketer's job. So you're dealing with like, what's my proposition? What's the strategy? You're looking at basically the product and proposition and go to market, how you sell, as well as obviously the final bit, which might be then what you tell customers about who you are, which is the advertising. So there's far more to marketing than people realize. So partly marketing isn't very good at marketing itself as a career.
That's interesting.
As I found there. But come back to your question about what's amazing today compared to when I grew up is a number of things. Firstly, you can network with anybody on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. So if you know where you want to go, you know the type of job you want to do, you can reach out to anyone with that job title today on LinkedIn, and there's a good chance they'll meet up with you and give you advice. And I found through my career, the more I've gone in, the more I've relied on my network. And in fact, having a podcast is an amazing networking tool in itself, right? So the first thing to say is you can build your network today with anybody you want to, anywhere in the world. That did not exist 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I started out. The second thing is you can prove your marketing skills today for free in public, YouTube, right? You can make a video in about 5 minutes with AI. And if your idea is good enough, that can be on YouTube and people can be watching it anywhere in the world. So you can literally build out your CV in real time. And then you can network with the people that might give you the job.
And you can do both of those things together, right? So you can DM the person on LinkedIn, the head of marketing at Gymshark or wherever, with, what do you think of this little video I made?
You could pitch. I know you've had Gymshark founder Ben Francis on your show, right? You could pitch Ben Francis for a job today. You could make some social content for them. You could put it online. You could get people to vote for it. You could create a whole social campaign around why they should give you the job, and you could make your pitch in public and get his attention.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. So talk to me about the marketing industry, because I have had to learn quite a lot about it, sort of being an entrepreneur and whatever. You have to be head of marketing, sales, all the different kind of points, finance as well. But what's the gold star degree, or is there one in marketing?
Well, this is part of the problem, right? So if you go into law, you obviously go and do a law degree. If you become an accountant, you do the Chartered Institute of Accountancy. Most industries have a qualification that marks you out as a marketer. Marketers don't, right? So in fact, I think the equivalent, maybe the CIM, is sort of for people that aren't maybe want to get into marketing more junior level. Now that is starting to change. So Mark Ritson, he's a professor from Melbourne. He's a brilliant guy. He's created this thing called the Mini MBA, which is basically like a fast track induction into quality marketing and what it looks like and all the academic theory behind it and practice. But he's quite rare. So most marketers today have got zero marketing qualifications. In fact, I think it's about 75, 80% of marketers have no marketing training, which is a shame on the profession, because it's a tough job and it's an ambiguous job. Because unlike accountancy, where the answer is precise, with marketing, the answer is imprecise. So there is no perfect answer. It's a balance of things that you know and things you don't know. It's a balance of short term, it's a balance of long term. And has a campaign worked? It is quite a hard thing to measure. Attributing the success of something is quite difficult. So because it's both an art and a science, it therefore becomes something that you do have to get trained on. You have to understand the tools. You have to get lots of experience as well as to how to do it.
So talk to us about what's in that kind of like marketing journey then. If advertising is kind of like finishing 5-10%, what are the sort of bits that go along that then? Talk us through the sort of marketing campaign journey.
Yeah, so people see it's a bit like in retail. They talk about the final 2 yards is the bit people see, right? There's all the bit that goes before it. So it starts out with consumer understanding, right? Diagnosis of the situation. So you understand what your position in the market is. You understand where you're going as a brand. You understand what you stand for. And then you have to understand who your customer is, why they buy you, what they want, how they live their life, that kind of thing. So consumer insight is incredibly important. Then basically you need to come up with a strategy, right? So how are we going to achieve this? And there's a thing in marketing called the 4 Ps, price, place, product, promotion. And actually those haven't changed. So despite technology changing, the basics are: have you got a good product? Is it available where I need it? Is it priced correctly? And is it being promoted in the right way? Right. So there's some core questions you need to ask. And then for each of those, you need to come up with a plan and execution. And so advertising is a small part of one of the Ps, which is promotion. But because it's the one that has a lot of money spent against it, it's the one that most people see. That's the one we tend to overly talk about and discuss in marketing.
But it's true that, because I think sometimes we can fall guilty into everything is changing so dramatically so fast. And actually it's one of Jeff Bezos's oldest quotes, right, about like what is going to remain the same. And it's a point that I try and make in schools and so on, is that 7 out of every 8 jobs in the United Kingdom are in the private sector. And the private sector's jobs are essentially to research and create a product that you can sell for more than it costs you to buy, and can you get that in front of people, and can you persuade them to sell it? So actually all of that journey like remains the same. Now all the tools that you use at every single stage have changed in the last 10 years, right? Like, if I'm speaking to a conference that's primarily full of 40 and 50-year-olds, none of their jobs are the same as what they were 10 years ago, right? So it's all changed in that time as well. And I think sometimes we kind of like slightly forget that, and we can overcomplicate things. Do you think there's a bit of that in marketing, in terms of there being a lexicon that's kind of used that's a bit impenetrable?
Marketing is completely the worst profession for this, right? we are obsessed with the drug of change, right? So it might be NFTs one year, then it's going to be the metaverse the next year. And of course, currently it's AI, right? We become absolutely obsessed with change. But fundamentally, most things don't change. And what doesn't change at all is how humans behave, how they make decisions. So we've evolved over millions of years, right? So we're not suddenly about to, as human beings, suddenly change the way in which we make our minds up about things. So the thing with marketing is to understand the fundamentals of why people buy what they buy. And then the vehicle of communication could change, but the reason and motivations people have for buying things, and the needs they have, the wants and desires they have, those things don't change. And so really the skill of the marketer, as Jeff Bezos say, build your business on the things that won't change, and then understand the tools and really evaluate the tools. And like if a new tool is good and it helps you do your job better, great, use it. But if it doesn't, then don't just use it because it's new. And so many marketers fall into that trap.
And how is the sort of, one of the things that I'm fascinated about, and I go and speak about at places, is sort of status, right? And the kind of like status of different jobs, but also the status within industries as well. And I remember talking to my dad quite recently about this. He was a coal miner, right? Like, it's become funny how we've all become sort of like Romans in terms of how we have to introduce ourselves as the profession that our fathers did. It's like Rishi Sunak, son of a pharmacist, Keir Starmer, son of a toolmaker, etc. But I mentioned was like, oh, you were at the coalface or whatever, and he was like, oh, no, I wasn't at the coalface. Like that was a completely different level, etc. And so on. And it's just like funny how those kind of things happen. So what's in the marketing world? What are the kind of like modern status drivers? Because I imagine it's probably quite partly because there aren't degrees and things like that necessarily sort of separate people out. What are the sort of like status markers?
Yeah, that's a really cool question. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think in marketing, there's certain more trendy parts of marketing, isn't there? So, I mean, advertising is typical, but also social media, right? So if you're managing kind of social media campaigns for a brand, that would be seen as very sexy. Doing the
Yeah.
strategy isn't, right? And yet it's very, very valuable. So it's a bit like in creative agencies, everyone celebrates the creative, but no one celebrates the planners and the account managers.
Yeah.
And actually the planners and account managers got a really, really important role to play because they understand what the brand needs to do. They think about how the campaign's going to work. And the creative obviously does the magic at the end. But there are certain jobs that I think we kind of celebrate more and ones we don't celebrate less. The other thing probably in marketing as well, I mean, the podcast I host is called Uncensored CMO. And like any career, the C-suite is kind of elevated beyond reason. Yeah. But there's a bit of truth, though, here, because everyone wants to be a CMO until they become one. And the reality is the CMO is rarely the best marketer in the organization. In fact, what people don't understand is chief marketing officers don't do any marketing. That what they do is politics, they do persuasion, they do planning, and they do people issues. I often call it the real 4 Ps of marketing, of the CMO. And I think people have an idealized idea, wouldn't it be great to be in charge? Suddenly I can make all these decisions. I could do the most amazing marketing. But actually, if you're running a large team, the chances are that your team will be doing the work. Your job will be doing, sorting out some crisis that's just happened. It'll be thinking ahead to the budget for next year. It'll be planning how you're going to get your brand out of a tight spot. It'll be thinking about the next innovation that's coming on. And so actually being a successful CMO, in this case, the skill set is completely different to the skill set that might have got you to that position. So often when I'm talking to people that want to be a CMO, I have to sort of break down the fact that you need a completely new toolkit. And the toolkit you need is unlike the one that's kind of got you to where you are today.
I think I know the answer to this, but are CEOs more aware of that with CMOs than they are with other people? Because it's probably true of the whole C-suite, actually, is that you basically stop doing the job that you initially got you noticed and sort of ploughed you through the ranks, right?
Yeah. Well, I think I agree. There's a small nuance, I think, with marketing is that marketing can be blamed for everything and marketing can be blamed for nothing. So the danger is with marketing is when things are going well, it's a team effort. And when things are going badly, it's marketing fault. So because marketing can be everything is marketing, really. I mean, I think there's a famous quote that basically that everything in business comes down to marketing and innovation, really, when you think about it. And the problem is that basically if something goes wrong, the chances are you'll be blamed for it.
Yeah.
Whereas actually if you're in production or in finance or in sales, the advantage you've got is you've got hard numbers. We know how much we made yesterday, we know how much we sold today, and we know, tomorrow we'll know how much profit we made. And they're very tangible.
Yeah.
And marketing,
if we reduce the price by this much, we get it
it's predictable, it's tangible, and you're dealing in certainty. And when you're dealing in certainty, it's much more defensible. When you're dealing in more ambiguity about, we did a big new advertising campaign, has it worked yet? Well, advertising works over the long term. So if you judge it in the short term, you could judge it too soon. So I think marketers are in a precarious position on the C-suite, and they have, I think, statistically the shortest tenure of any role because of this pressure that gets put on them.
And do you think, as somebody who had a bit of economics and like a little bit of finance kind of career experience, that in the long term has been an advantage?
Massive. The one thing that marketers are pretty right, well, there's a few things they're not good at, but the thing they're least good at is finance.
Yeah.
And the irony is that marketing is about business, right? Your job is to create demand in the future, to grow your brand, to be noticed and to make the company more successful in the long term.
Yeah.
In fact, of all the C-suite roles, the marketing role is the one that's got the most future focus, right? So it's absolutely critical. But the one thing that almost every marketer I've ever met is rubbish at is finance. And that's a problem because in the board, that's what you're dealing with. You're dealing with money, you're dealing with finance, you're dealing with P&L, you're dealing with strategy. And therefore, the most successful marketers are the ones that are fluent in finance and can position marketing in a way that the C-suite understand, and particularly in a way that the CFO understands. So, yeah, building that relationship between the CMO and the CFO is a key one.
So let's talk a bit about the future of marketing, where it's heading and so on, because it does endlessly fascinate me. And it's one of the things that I've realised that I am quite interested in, sort of running this show and so on. But let's take recent history and kind of like 2 recent case studies. So Sydney Sweeney and the Great Jeans advert, and then let's also talk a little bit about Jaguar and the car rebrand on that, because it strikes me as those are moments that hit a kind of like cultural zeitgeist as well, or almost became it as well. So talk us through what your kind of like perception of them were?
Yeah.
Let's do a case study of Sydney Sweeney first.
Sydney Sweeney first. Yeah, let's talk about Sydney Sweeney and her genes. So the background to this one is...
You may have noticed we've been doing something different recently. From our budget live stream to the episode where I sat down with the producers, we've been experimenting with new formats that you've been asking for. We want to do much more of that in 2026, but truthfully, those episodes don't quite perform like some of our blockbuster ones with prime ministers or business titans, even though amongst our core fans, they're often your favourite. So in early 2026, we're giving you the opportunity to be even more involved with the show, and we are launching Jimmy's Jobs Backstage. The waitlist is now open, and if you pledge your annual support, we'll etch your name into our brand new studio. We'll be able to bring you more into the show by listening to your guest suggestions and your questions that you have for them. And there'll also be more live shows next year which you'll get early access to. If you or someone you know are a fan of this new way of doing media, check out the show notes to see how to join us backstage, or give it as a Christmas gift. And hey, you might even be able to put it through your learning and development budget. See you backstage. Now back to the episode.
American Eagle, the largest denim company in the US, they partnered with Sydney Sweeney. Obviously, you know, everyone knows who Sydney Sweeney is. Very, very famous, very relevant at the moment in lots of kind of movies that have done very well. And a great fit, kind of in terms of their audience and her audience as well. And they came up with this campaign with her wearing their jeans, fairly obvious, and they were looking for a little twist on the campaign. So they, rather than saying Sydney Sweeney has great genes, they changed it to genes, as in genetics.
Yeah.
Right. Now it's a phrase that we've all used, and Jimmy's got good genes, he's athletic, he's good looking, the whole thing, right? I know people must say that quite a lot, So, and what happened is, the campaign launched, it picked up, it did very well, it had tens of millions of views, and it had done quite well. A few days into the campaign, a small number of people on some sort of quite progressive left-wing kind of accounts picked up on a genetic angle, picked up on the genes angle, and basically saying it kind of felt a little bit white supremacy, that it was kind of because it was Sydney Sweeney and she's young and blonde and blue-eyed, they kind of picked up a kind of white supremacy angle on it. And then what happened is it got politicized. So the right wing, I think there was a right wing account called Libs of TikTok that then basically parodied the reaction. And then before you knew it, there was this huge debate about race and white supremacy and eugenics, basically, that then fired up. Everyone got outraged on both sides of the debate, as you can imagine. And it just created this most incredible viral moment for the brand, where billions and billions of impressions globally. It was talked about everywhere. The campaign reached, every corner of the earth. Now, what of course happened, which often does, well, it doesn't always happen in this situation, but sales went up. Yeah. So because everyone's talking about the brand, I actually met the CMO Craig, who runs the brand, and talked to him about the campaign on the podcast, and they won 1 million extra customers during that campaign. Oh, okay. It was the best period of trading they've ever had. I mean, it's phenomenally successful. And what was interesting about Zeitgeist is, I think maybe a year or two ago, the brand would have apologized. It would have probably been encouraged to apologise for any offence caused, preemptively almost, to kind of say, if anyone's taken offence, we apologise, we'll retract the campaign. But actually they did the opposite. They didn't double down, but they committed to what they'd started. Yeah. And in fact, Sydney Sweeney's going to be coming back out with another campaign for them as well, coming soon. So I thought that was interesting, because I'm pretty sure most marketers would have apologised and changed course, but actually it was interesting that they decided to keep going.
Because Trump weighed in on it as well, right? Which I think is when it sort of first came to my kind of like attention in my political timeline as well. And that's just interesting as well, right? Like him sort of wading into something like that.
And you get all sorts of weird conspiracy theories about, were they donors to the Republican Party, and did they have links to the Ku Klux Klan? I mean, this I suppose is the negative of social media, is that, conspiracy theories abound and then they become the story and so on. So again, I think interestingly, actually, the reaction of the CMO, Craig, he turned off social media and didn't pay any attention to it. And instead he went back to the research, went back to the plan and said, what did we intend to say? Are we doing the right thing? And then he commits the business to stick the course, which I think is good, because these things blow over pretty quickly. And then
no, it's interesting on that. There's definitely been some times in the last few years in politics and whatever where I've benefited from deleting social media and so on, because it just ends up everyone with an opinion and a different angle on everything. It just becomes completely like exhausting. But it has led to sales increasing, right? Because that was one of my sort of big questions. Right?
Yeah, they did incredibly well, and I think the headlines are 1 million extra customers won in the few weeks after the share price went up. I don't have the stats quite to hand, but I think 20-25%. And it's a brand that had been on a slow decline. If you look at the share price for the last kind of 2 or 3 years, it's been in gradual decline. So in a highly competitive market, they're obviously up against Gap, they're up against Levi's, and they've all got big celebrities as well on their campaign. So, he talks about it as the great jeans war of 2025. You got Beyonce on Levi's, and I think there was the pop group that Gap had come out with just afterwards as well. So it became a very cultural conversation, like, jeans and celebrities and who's going to win this. So,
and where do you think the future of that kind of lies in terms of, like, very hard to plan virality like that, right? Like, you can't sort of do it. But like, what does the future sort of look like? Do you think we're going to see brands leaning into it kind of being edgier? Because like you say, there's been quite a sort of move in the last perhaps decade or so where it's been the adverts at Cannes and so on have been very kind of like much more kind of purpose led, less of the sort of risque sort of shock side of things.
I think there's two things probably going to happen at the same time. I mean, there's been a number of very public kind of backlashes. I mean, Bud Light with Dylan Mulvaney was another one that about 18 months ago. Cracker Barrel as well. That's a very American brand, but they rebranded and got, I think Trump weighed in on that one as well. That got negative backlash. So I think there's two things going to happen. I think one thing that's going to happen.
What happened with those ones?
I mean, Bud Light was astonishing, really. I mean, they had partnered with Dylan Mulvaney, so a trans influencer. She had posted some content, and that had been picked up by some of the right-wing media in the US, and there'd been this kind of protest against Bud Light, and everyone was kind of protesting and stopping buying it. Now, this was unusual because normally when that happens, nothing actually happens in the real world. It's just a storm on social media. This was unusual because it actually did filter into the brand sales, and it's interesting in terms of why. It wasn't necessarily that people stopped drinking Bud Light, but the distributors, the people that stocked it, started to switch out to other brands, and the retailers put less space to Bud Light compared to other brands. So it was quite interesting that it was more the business to business, the supply chain that made the decision, and therefore that's what cost them cost them sales rather than necessarily customer demand.
And why do you think they made that sort of decision with that then?
Well, I think they probably brought into the hype that, suddenly no one's going to drink the beer anymore, and therefore it's not in demand, so we won't stock it as much. We'll switch it out for Michelob Ultra, which, by the way, is made by the same company. So the brand that benefited was also from the same company. So it helps to have two horses in a race.
And the Cracker Barrel one, what was that?
Well, Cracker Barrel one was interesting. So this is where this is quite a funny one because something that gets every marketer likes to do a rebrand because if you start out, I mean, marketing jobs are short-lived, right? So you think in the window I've got on this brand, I'm going to have to do a rebrand because I need to leave my mark on it. So marketers love doing this, right? But consumers like familiarity. They like things to stay the same. And so most rebrands don't work. And what happened is that this rebrand had been planned, and it was actually, I met the team that did it, and they did a really good job on it. But unfortunately, a few people picked it up, and they couldn't believe that that there was an iconic guy in the logo. They'd taken him off, and there's this big sort of emotional response to you're messing with something that we love, and you don't really understand us, and so on. So there was a big protest about bring back the old logo. So halfway through this big rebrand, and by the way, this isn't just a logo. This is merchandise. This is actual stores and outlets and uniforms and staff training and so on. This was a huge, big operation to make this rebrand, and it got reversed. So they had to kind of undo it all. But it's one of those things where if you look objectively at what they were trying to do in terms of rebrand, it was what every brand does regularly, but they happened to be the one that got caught up in the PR, it got caught up in the social storm, and therefore they had to react to it. And I think what might happen is I think brands are starting to realize that you don't manage your brand by social media. You need to manage your brand by the actual customers that pay to come in your stores or buy your products. And I think marketers are starting to learn a lesson now, because I think we got very carefully PR trained to be very sensitive to what people say about our brand online. But online isn't the real world. And you need to differentiate between when it's genuine feedback that you should listen to and when it's just, particularly with algorithmic feeds, where actually rage is rewarded, isn't it, with engagement. So you become overexposed to negative sentiment and controversy.
Yeah.
It doesn't reflect how people actually feel.
Yeah, but if it's 1% of the population and none of them are customers, then it always
Exactly. And the chances are the people complaining are not people that buy products anyway.
Yeah.
So
yeah, exactly. Who's a kind of like rising star in the kind of like marketing world? If we were doing a kind of like pass the mic sort of session.
Well, someone I think is doing an incredible job is, have you come across Duolingo at all? Have you followed what they're doing? So Duolingo is basically an app where you can learn a language. And they've created this character called Duo, this kind of green owl. And their head of social media, Zaria Parvez, who's been on the podcast, straight out of college, got a job as basically in their social team. And she's created tens of millions of followers for the brand through her social media, and through Duo. But what she's done incredibly well is everyone says, oh, how do you make this go viral, right? Every marketer wants a viral hit. But actually what she did, I think, was really smart. So she created a character that enabled the brand to have a personality, to turn up at, film premieres, or to turn up in your feed, or to kind of, make a joke out of a current event. So firstly, she created a character. Secondly, she realized that it's about entertainment, right? The problem with advertising is most advertising's dull, but she actually made it really entertaining. And then what she did is she built a story over a long period of time. So one funny example is Duo the owl was trying to court Dua Lipa, right? So they basically trolled Dua Lipa, trying to get her attention. And they failed to do so, right? Until this year, they came up with the idea of let's kill Duo. This is during the Super Bowl, right? So during the Super Bowl, they killed off Duo as a big stunt, right? And because they'd built up such a fan base, the world went mad going, what's happened to Duo? Is Duo dead? What's gone on? Anyway, Duo's ashes turned up at Dua Lipa's house. She was at pains to tell me, by the way, it was matcha, by the way. So it wasn't the real ashes. Just, if anyone out there worried about that, actually killed this owl. Exactly. We're on the phone. It was matcha powder. So anyway, we were reassured by that. That's the first time they got her attention. So Dua Lipa tweeted, her response to it after receiving that. So that's a small example, but what she achieved in terms of creating a brand over a number of years, by using the power of social media, creating a character, thinking about the story that the brand's going to have, thinking about the personality and tone of voice. And she had an excuse to inject their brand into culture, like during the Super Bowl or Christmas, or opening of a big new store, or a big big event, a big concert. That the owl would turn up and everyone would be photographing Duo the owl. So I think what she's done is phenomenal, and she's now she's now head of social at DoorDash, which is a huge, huge US food delivery company. Yeah, delivery basically of America.
How much of stuff like that is pre-planned in terms of so one of my favorite examples of this was Greg's launching the vegan sausage roll and Piers Morgan just sort of kicking off and so on. And I just thought it's kind of like a match made in heaven. They both sort of benefit from it. How often is that sort of done?
I think a lot more than you think. A lot more than you think. No one ever says it's pre-planned, right? Because it kind of takes the mystique away. So it's always told as this kind of lucky accident that happened to keep the kind of mystery alive. But most viral successes that I've come across and teams that I've worked with and have interviewed, that what you do is you plan for different outcomes, right? So, if this happens in the Super Bowl, we're going to do this. If that happens, we're going to do that. So a lot of work and a lot of planning usually goes into the viral success. The other thing I'd say as well is that you need to, if you take Duolingo as a good example, right? The fact that goes viral is not because one day they woke up and had this crazy idea and it went viral. They've put years and a lot of time and a lot of money into basically creating the circumstances that might then potentially go viral. So I think it's not just did the moment itself, was that plan, but it's also the work that goes before that you put yourself in a position where you might just go viral.
So I've got sort of two kind of like stories on this from a Jimmy's Jobs perspective, which I just think you might find funny and amusing. On the branding bit and the artwork, like we have not changed it since we launched 5 years ago. Part of it is like, it feels very sort of special to me in terms of like, that was like the first bit where it all really began to feel real. And I remember commissioning someone to do it for like 150 quid and so on. Part of it is like, I'm just like, there's just another thing to do. And I don't think it really kind of makes any impact. But like, we're still keeping it the same. And the other is like, we were thinking about whether there's a character that could ever be used for Jimmy's Jobs, something for the backdrop or something like that. I was talking to Elf Samba about it, and we were sort of just joshing along with the idea of keeping the sort of J in it and so on. And we came up with Jimmy the jellyfish, but like perhaps that wouldn't quite work. What do you think? What should we do?
Do you know what? It doesn't matter what you do as long as it's distinctive and associated with you. So if you take Octopus Energy, right? Octopus Energy have got a bright pink octopus, right?
A quick thanks to Octopus Energy for supporting this episode. Now, a lot of people know about Octopus for their home energy products. I have recommended people switch to them for years. But what you might not know is that they are now rolling out more products across home and businesses, from solar panels, EV chargers, heat pumps. So if you're thinking of upgrading your home or business and you are a Jimmy's Jobs listener, you can ping Jimmy at octopus.energy and get the very latest deals and insights. And if you're already on the journey with Octopus, leave us a comment or a message. I'd love to hear how it's going with their wider products. All right, back to the episode.
That's a bit crazy, right? Like octopuses aren't pink, right? but they stand out. And I mean, pink's a lovely colour, but it's different. And in marketing science, the most important thing is to be distinctive, because being distinctive is, so in marketing, we have this big argument, right? And it's basically, is it better to be distinctive or different? And the answer is it's better to be distinctive. But everyone focuses on being different. But your goal is to be remembered. So in one sense, it doesn't matter what the mascot is. What really matters is that people remember it.
Yeah.
And that they associate it with you. So what you want to do is you want to make people feel good when they see it, and you want to make sure they remember and associate it with Jimmy's Jobs of the Future. That's the task. So jellyfish would work. Obviously, the J. Come up with an unusual colour for a jellyfish that people are not expecting, and then just make sure it kind of like associates itself with you.
And what do you? I mean, it is amazing. Like my kids see like the van and so on and get like super excited about it, and like it's.
I was a bit shocked, but I met Greg the other day. Actually, we were doing an advert together actually for the Marketing Society, and we were both being interviewed. 7 or 8 of us being interviewed as this kind of mashup video that they were producing. And in my head, I assumed that the toy octopus was this incredible success because it's like, I mean, this when you've got kids, right? And any kind of soft, cuddly toy is an instant hit.
Yeah.
And the way to get to your heart is through your kids, right? So if your energy provider gives away cuddly octopuses, I mean, that for me seems like marketing nirvana.
Yeah.
But apparently he said he just had a hunch on it and he bought a couple of thousand. And then I was expecting the story to be, and we sold out in 30 minutes. And then he said, I was left with like 1,980. I'm like, man. I think it does end well. He didn't then tell the rest of the story, but obviously the fact they've carried on with it, I assume it did become a hit. But it's like most successful things that they take a lot longer than you think they're going to do.
Yeah.
And I often say to people, it takes on average about 7 years to have an overnight success.
Yeah.
And any entrepreneur like Greg will tell you the amount of hard work that went in before the thing that we all associate with them has happened.
Amazing.
Yeah.
They also do solar panels and electric vehicles, which you can find out more by checking out the show notes.
Very
Classic,
good.
Like Mike C, right? I'm going pro.
You're a pro.
I can't imagine doing that 5 years ago. I tell you, like, talk about skills and.
That's wild, isn't it? Yeah, is the podcast like? How do you imagine it when you started, and how is it today?
Yeah, well, let's get into it. Let's just chat about the like jobs of podcasting and so on, because there's definitely like a element of classic another white middle class male going through an identity crisis. Of course, has got a podcast and so on. But I think one of the things that did make a difference when I started it was the only thing that I was doing really. Like it was a lockdown thing, and so on. And I guess I thought I never thought it would kind of like blow up to where it has, but I also thought there was definitely an element. I knew I was onto something. I knew the sort of wider thing about entrepreneurs creating jobs. It ticked lots of boxes for me, lots of passions and so on. And it does feel a bit like that Steve Jobs commencement speech where I sort of tied a lot of things that I'd kind of been picking up along the way to sort of do. But yeah, it's kind of like I've spent a lot of my time, because one of the things is the amount of time you spend on distribution, right? Like, and I thought initially, like, naive enough to be like, well, just have a good podcast with good people on, and that will be enough. Like, turns out it's not. And you have to think about market and distribution, right? And that is partly that's changed a lot in 5 years as well. Right, LinkedIn now is much more of a kind of platform for it, and as a Jobs to the Future podcast, that's like really fertile kind of like ground for us. And like now, I don't think. When I started 5 years ago, I don't think you could even upload video on there and so on. So, these things change. How do you think it's? Because you started even earlier than me in that sense.
Yeah.
You were a couple of years ahead of that, like pre-pandemic, right? Because that
was it was just before the pandemic, and one of the decisions was, do we continue in the pandemic? And in fact, actually, what I like anybody else, I think I was missing talking to people, and that kind of connection, and so. Oddly, I continued it during the pandemic more for myself, I think, just to kind of talk to people and compare experience and so on like that. But you're right. I mean, it feels weird looking back to that time actually, and compared to now. And as you say, you start out and you go, oh, 100 people listen to this, and then and you set a bar and go, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if 1,000 people listen? Then you get to 1,000 people, and then get to 10,000, then it's like 100,000. Like, wow. Like this seems unreal because, you're putting the same love and care and effort into each kind of episode, but the numbers of people on the other side listening. And it's a weird thing I find as well, because you don't necessarily get feedback immediately. It's not like on social media, you've got so many metrics instantly at your disposal, views and click through and who, what demographic of person, watched it or listened to it. But podcasting's, the technology is a bit antiquated, so you don't get that much feedback, do you?
No. Data analytics around podcasting.
They're terrible. It's really embarrassing, actually. And there's no search function. There's no way of promoting your podcast over someone else's, which in a way is kind of nice in one sense, because it's the only organic media in the world, right?
Yeah.
It's the only one where you've got zero barrier to entry. Everyone's on a level playing field, and the best ones will rise to the top. So, which is kind of nice. But the downside is you've got none of the tools that you have on other platforms to kind of boost yourself or promote your way.
But do you think all that's changing, what you just said there? Because I agree with you, it was part of the appeal. Part of the reason I started it was that it was like, 50 quid on Amazon Mic and hiring an editor to get going. Well, let's just sort of prototype and see. And I think that's one of the things we chatted about on your podcast is just prototyping and trying other careers if you can and so on is really important. And yeah, after 8 episodes, I loved it and was getting good feedback from it. I also think there's an interesting point about the stuff that we do, which is quite businessy, just doesn't provoke quite as much opinion. You probably get more of it in marketing. That's why I wanted to ask about Jaguar, because whenever we talk about that, it always does well. But I think where it's sports and politics, which are two other big podcasting areas, they provoke opinion. So you get a lot more kind of feedback on it in that sense. But yeah, do you think the sort of barriers to entry have changed?
I don't think they've changed much, but I think the competition is insane.
Yeah.
So arrogantly or not, I think when I launched, I felt like I was offering something a bit better than what was out there. I certainly had a bit more experience than other podcasters, as in I'd done the job myself for 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So I came to it knowing a bit about marketing. I had a really good network myself as well, so I could get good guests on.
Yes.
So I was punching above my weight in terms of other podcasts, or punching above other podcasts' weight, maybe to say that. I mean, there were certainly some very good ones at the time. Now I look at it and go, holy smoke, most other marketing podcasts are getting similar guests to me. Their production quality is really good. The frequency of output is high. So certainly in the era I'm in, the bar has gone up a lot in terms of quality. The barrier to entry, I think, is the same in terms of as you say, 50 quid Amazon Mic and off you go, right? So anyone can start, but I think you'd find it tougher. Or actually it's tougher to sustain. So what I do notice is, what I see certainly in the marketing or sort of marketing/business category that I'm in, there's a lot of podcasts that come out that do well just for a short period of time, and then they drop off. And then there are a few that are sustained that end up kind of remaining at the top. And I fortunately, touch lots of wood, Uncensored CMO has kind of remained up there. But I think it's also a longevity game. It's a bit like anything. It's like a bit like fitness, isn't it? You have to put in the hours. You have to be consistent. You have to keep raising the bar with quality. You have to promote. You don't know which one's going to get, going to be a viral hit, but the more you promote, the more content you create, the more you start to see, the good content coming out.
What do you think has allowed you to keep that consistency going and keep it up?
I think for me, I think there's a number of things actually. Firstly, the success of the podcast is tied to my day job, which is really helpful. So I had my sort of OG kind of backer is System 1, which is where I'm Chief Customer Officer, right? And as part of my basically I wanted to meet other marketers because I wanted to build relationships with other marketers who may at some point in the future then buy from System 1. So because I had a reason beyond the podcast to do it, it meant that it didn't matter how many views I got. It didn't matter that, I was on the 10th or 20th or 30th episode. The point was, who was I meeting? And, were they kind of good potential contacts for System 1? And then over time, what I realized is as more and more people listened, actually people were starting to phone up System 1 because they listened to me talk about my job. So it actually created not just a network for me personally, but it also created a media vehicle to tell the story of the company I work for. So because of those two angles, it meant that I kind of had this incentive to keep it going. And then, as you said, you get this feedback loop, don't you? You get, people like the show, and I've risen up the charts. And then you get on that drug of you start to see the numbers go up, and it's very satisfying. I mean, I joke actually because I was nominated as one of the top performance marketers last year. Now, within marketing, you've got two tribes, right? You've got brand marketers and you've got performance marketers. And so I'm very much in the brand marketer camp. So to get nominated by Performance Marketing World was this sort of quite in joke, John is always dismissing performance marketing as being a bit dirty. Bottom of the funnel, they call it, it's all about conversion.
Go down a status thing.
Completely right. This is exactly the status thing, right? So it's a bit of an in joke. But when it comes to podcasts, I'm probably the top performance marketer in the world because I'm obsessed with the data. I'm like, what do we learn from this? How many people have listened? How long have they listened? Are they listening again?
Yeah.
And the data's a drug as well, isn't it? But it's a feedback loop and I think the statistic, I'd have to fact check myself on this one, but there's a ridiculous number of podcasts that never make it past the 3rd episode or the 10th episode or the 20th. I mean, it's staggering. I think 95% of podcasts don't make the 20th episode or something like that. So it definitely rewards consistency and learning and improving and continually raising the bar.
How has it changed the way you ask questions?
That's a very good one. That's a really, really good one. What I'm trying, actually, this is a work in progress, I think, for me. So I'm naturally curious and I naturally love conversations with people. I naturally love finding the story. I think what I'm thinking a bit more now is working back from the headline and the social content in a way that I didn't do before. So I think when I started, I'd probably just go, let's have a great conversation, right? Whereas now what I think about is what are the fault lines in marketing? So you mentioned Jaguar, right? Jaguar is a fault line in marketing. What I mean by that is that everyone's got an opinion and it divides even, clever marketers who would normally agree, their opinion. So for example, Mark Ritson and Rory Sutherland, right? I have equal massive respect for both of them, right? I'm a big fan of both of them. They have the opposite opinion on whether Jaguar did the right thing or not. So when you find a story like that, I know that is going to be good content because it divides the very best in our industry, right? So I think I've learned to find the fault line, right? That is going to divide people and make people, basically make people kind of talk about it. And then the next thing I try and do is then think about what is useful in this conversation and can it be broken down simply? So I had the Unilever CMO on my last episode. She was amazing, right? Because she could break down why something works. So she'd go, here are 6 ways in which social media is most effective in Unilever. Here's my 5-point framework for how we build brands. And being able to communicate something so useful in a clear framework that's memorable is a great way to do that. So to answer your question in terms of how I approach the interview, thinking about where's the fault line that's going to create the story, and then thinking about what's most useful to communicate in a simple way that can be clipped up and then distributed, because then that creates the distribution that leads people into the podcast that hopefully then leads to a subscriber listening.
Yeah, that's...
Out of interest, by the way, would you agree with that? Has that been your experience as well?
Not quite the same, but I think it's different. I think that is a good way of thinking about it. And I definitely do think more about like, okay, what's the social story here? Like, how are we going to frame it from the outset? And I resisted that for a long time in the way that I resisted going on TikTok with it and so on. Because I was like, we're a long form, serious business podcast. But actually, after a couple of years, it was like, well, yeah, we need to reach more people. Like, how are we going to do that? Well, it's kind of through socials, really, is the kind of only way of it. So I definitely think more about that, and I've got more comfortable with that, just in the same way that newspaper journalists have snappier headlines, which aren't always quite sort of like entirely representative of what is written beneath and so on. So that has definitely been something that has taken a little time to get used to. I think thinking particularly when we do the big politicians, thinking of what I term the unlock question, which is how they're going to, even though they know they're doing a podcast and they know that it's not the Today Programme studio, is like, how do you get them to sort of subconsciously realise that and kind of like, I can ease into that sort of a bit more. Has been quite a big thing, and that's something I put a lot of time and thought into, particularly when you're doing somebody like a Blair, who's probably like the most interviewed Briton that's ever lived, right? Like, is like, okay, how am I going to get something that's different? And it's almost like a personal kind of goal of like, not only do you want to get elicit different information, but you want to ask something that have not been asked before as well. So that's kind of like quite a sort of thing that I find.
I spend a lot of time on that as well, because it's easy. Like, ChatGPT will give you every question, right?
Yeah.
That person's ever been asked, right? It's a real skill. Well, two things are a skill. Number one, to find the question no one's asked, but number two, to ask it in a way and make the person comfortable enough that you're going to get an answer that's unexpected.
Yeah.
As well. One thing actually, but you'll know this extremely well. One thing actually, producer James and I have kind of started doing is recording before the podcast has begun and after the podcast begun, because the people are so much more relaxed before the cameras roll, right? And when cameras stop. And if you can ask a question while you're still sat in this position with somebody in a slightly different way or a bit more casual, their guard just drops.
Yeah.
And you just get something really interesting.
Yeah.
That's kind of very authentic and so on. So, I mean, James kind of added onto an episode we did recently where the conversation that happened just after, he added it at the end of the podcast episode. And I think that's something I'm going to experiment a bit more with, because how do you capture people in the most relaxed, most vulnerable, most honest moment?
Well, I think so. In politics, that is termed at the margins of the meetings, which I always found was like an interesting thing, because often you do get the most sort of out of people.
Are you allowed to cover that, by the way? So if you've got something is it in the margins, you say?
In the margins.
Out the margins. So what if you reported on something that's out of the margins? Would you get into trouble?
Well, so I think that's where it's a grey area. I meant more the sort of like, the meetings with diplomats or like heads of state visit and so on. Like, it was almost those bits that the sort of would be the most interesting. I think with journalists it's different, but I think this is where it's different in terms of the rules are kind of being written a little bit, in terms of, because you would get, like, my background when I was starting off in politics was to basically get the mics off the politicians as soon as they'd finished, right? Because you didn't want a hot mic moment and so on. And we had Gillian Keegan on, who did that famous, like, why does no one ever tell me I'm doing an effing good job and whatever. So I think it's hard in that sense. I mean, we did it on your podcast and we had like a free chat at the end of it, and it's like, I've just said, well, we'll watch it back and just sort of check.
Exactly. You don't have to put it out.
Exactly. But that's the new rules. And like, when we did Starmer, they actually said to us, like, could you take this one question out? And I didn't have a problem with it particularly. And that actually happens quite a lot. And I think that's where they don't sort of, the handlers don't realise that it's kind of changed, and yes, you would sort of do that. But then it's also, you're completely within your right to be like, well, no, we're keeping that in as well. So like it's feeling that sort of way, that trust element is difficult.
It's a bit like meetings as well. 'Cause one thing I learned in my former career when I was kind of, doing a proper job rather than just chatting to people like this, which is great, by the way, was the meeting is never the meeting. Decisions never get taken in meetings. Decisions happen in the corridor. They happen after work. They happen on phone calls. They happen through alliances between people in preparations to meetings, right? The alignment, as people like to call it, is all done outside of the meeting. And the meeting is a performance. The meeting is to kind of performatively go through the decision-making process to agree what has been decided outside a meeting, right? And that it's a bit like that with this, because actually it's the conversations outside the podcast that often will be where people are not performing, where you're going to get the unvarnished truth. And so I think I want to find more creative ways of capturing. So we did a thing recently called Confessions of a CMO, where we basically anonymously interviewed CMOs, not on camera, on purpose, right? To find out what are they too scared to say? What would they say if there were no consequences to their answer?
Yeah.
Ask those kind of questions that actually unveil the real truth. I mean, man, you must know this with your politics career, is everyone is trained within an inch of their life to say the right thing, stick to a party line, right? They are so well trained to do that.
But I think that's changing though as well, right? Like with the sort of Trump Rogan 3-hour podcasts as well. I mean, I remember the PM's diary bid meetings like would be held like in the Thatcher study, and people would bring the various requests that they'd often received from whether it be newspaper journalists or like I would get a lot from the business community. We'll show up in this, we'll do that, etc. And you would take these things to it, but it was entirely like if you really wanted them to do something, you basically went around the room with people that were going to be there beforehand and be like, "Look, can you weigh in on this one, please?" And so on. So, it's really funny with that. I mean, I do think political communication will change quite a lot in the next few years, particularly as we seem to be entering in the UK a multi-party system as well, much more so as well. It's going to be kind of like fascinating to see how that all kind of works. And it will be interesting over the next few years when we know we're quite a long way from a general election. I think the sort of moment that the election is called, it might be interesting to see how it all sort of tightens. Not necessarily reverts to type, but yeah, I get a lot of the people asking me about predictions for podcasts and politics because that was what was the big thing at the Trump election. But I think by 2028, it might have shifted quite a lot again. So it's going to be, interesting.
Although I think the winner will be whoever plans now for that eventuality. Like, because we're so short-termist about this, including kind of in podcasting. But if you could build a podcast platform that basically takes the piss out of politics or something, and is something that everyone wants to tune into, and build that over the next 3 years, so that by the time the next election, politicians are bidding you to come on the show, not the other way around, right? You're going to have to do the bidding. This is, by the way, something I found on my podcast, is I started out having to, kind of pitch myself out to guests. Now I get pitched.
Yes.
In fact, it's 95% turning people down rather than the other way around. So the dynamic change, when you become the media, the power dynamic changes in that respect.
Yeah, that's definitely taken some kind of getting used to a little bit, I think. You spend so long kind of scrapping. I mean, you were talking about 7-year thing earlier, 7 year, there is a lot of scrapping that goes into those sort of first 3 or 4 years. And I think that's why a lot of people don't kind of like go through it and so on. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Well, look, we should definitely get you back on to talk about it. I tell you what, actually, before we round up, can we do Jaguar? Because we didn't actually do that. So let's do a few minutes on that. And so Sydney Sweeney, big story. Other big kind of like issue in marketing, big viral moment was the Jaguar kind of rebrand. And you had the MD come on and talk about it, right?
This is one of my favourite episodes I've ever done. It was a massive coup. So late last year, Jaguar announced their new concept car, right? The Type 00. Now, they did something I don't think any car company has done before, which is advertise a car when they're not selling cars. So this is part of the interesting part of the story, actually, is that Jaguar had planned to shut down production, have about an 18-month period of not selling any cars before they relaunched Jaguar as a brand with Type 00. So they literally are going back to the start. The positioning was a copy of nothing, which was an old, their founder basically said a Jaguar should always be a copy of nothing, and they were inspired by that to basically, come up with something completely new. And they announced this, but what they did before they announced it and went on a kind of tour of fashionable places, Paris and Milan and Miami and places like this, they did a teaser video. And the teaser video, it was just after, this is also important with politics, just after Trump, right, had got in. And it was very, very kind of, I suppose the phrasing, woke in quote unquote. So it's basically sort of androgynous looking people, very brightly coloured. It was kind of weird. I mean, basically, I thought it was like United Colours of Benetton. It looked like a fashion ad, right? It was kind of an upmarket fashion ad. There was no car in the ad. So Elon Musk even kind of go like, which car company advertises without showing you the car? Now, it was done as a teaser video, basically to signal the change that they were going through as an organisation. And everybody just lost it about this ad. It's ridiculous. It was post-Trump, so it got a lot of heat in terms of the kind of representation, how it was, done. And most people hated it, right? And particularly in marketing, everyone thought it was silly. And then the car came out 2 weeks later. And what the interesting thing about the car as well is that they designed it in this very unusual pink shade and this unusual blue shade. And I thought the car looked amazing. I mean, honestly, I'm a bit of a car nut. I mean, I used to go to motor shows when I was growing up, and I nothing excited me more than going to the NEC and going to the National Motor Show and looking at the Jaguar XJ220, right? Yeah. So I love cars, and so I was fascinated as a car geek. I thought this looked like kind of the Batmobile, but in pink.
Yeah.
But again, that created this visceral reaction from people. It's like, you can't have a car that colour. It just kind of offended people. So anyway, everyone thought the company had lost it. And in marketing, actually, the majority of people, including Mark Ritson, who I'm a massive, massive fan of, panned it because what they'd done is they'd kind of, they had repositioned away from their target audience. They weren't targeting kind of middle-aged men like us. They were targeting young, very ultra-wealthy, urban people in kind of mega cities around the world. But also they had sort of given up a lot of their distinctive assets. So a lot of the things that you associate with Jaguar, they'd kind of had kind of left or appeared to kind of given up in terms of the design language and that sort of thing. So it basically, from a marketing point of view, got absolutely panned. Interestingly, I think there were about 3 people in the world that thought it might be a good idea. So our good friend Rory Sutherland, his argument was, when a brand is in like trouble like they were, they've lost buyers for a decade basically, and they're almost non-existent as a brand. I think they sold 7,000 cars in America last year, the biggest market in the world, right? So when you're in that situation, the normal rules don't apply. You have to, roll the dice into 32 Reds, right? So his argument was there are rare occasions where actually you need to do something pretty crazy to get noticed again. I think Sir John Hegarty was one. And I looked at it and just went, do you know what? What they've done very well is got us all talking about the brand. Yeah. Now, what matters is, does the product live up to the hype, right? Yeah. If the product is as good as they suggest, then I think actually they'll have done very well, because it's more important that we're talking about the brand. I mean, who would have had, Jaguar on their bingo card as a brand we're all talking about, right? Yeah. And I think in terms of the brand perception, it is seen as a dusty old man's car, and not car of the future. So I thought it was pretty good. So I was desperate to get the managing director, Rawdon Glover, right? Who overseed it. Now, to give you a sense of how serious this was, he got death threats, and his team got death threats. It got so much rage, around this whole thing, and yet they've stuck to the plan. But what was interesting about talking to Rawdon is, once he explained the research they did, how advanced the car is, what their ambition is in terms of like the Jaguar. Imagine the Jaguar E-Type and how iconic that car is. That's what they're aiming for. They're not aiming to be the next BMW 3 Series. They're aiming to create a once in a generation icon. And to do that, you have to be taught. You have to be talked about. You have to see, kind of rappers driving it and wishing you could drive the same thing. And then when he broke down the economics of who they're targeting and the ultra wealthy and so on, it makes a lot of sense.
Have sales increased or orders?
Well, this is the funny thing, right? Because they had planned to shut the factory down. Now, of course, what happened is when they announced their Jaguar sales, sales had plummeted like 90% or 95%. Everyone jumped on social media and said, told you so. They do the rebrand. 3 months later, sales disappeared. But they're not going to sell the car until next year.
Yeah.
So this was always the plan. But of course, anybody that didn't do their research basically got fooled by the fact that, that the sales decline was a consequence of the rebrand, but it wasn't at all. Consequence of shutting the factory.
So talk to me about two kind of opposing brands here, right? Like Apple and sort of Vision Pro. And then at the other end of the branding spectrum, kind of Ryanair. So you've got Apple, Vision Pro, everything incredibly polished, thought about to within a millimetre. And then you've got Ryanair, which is just sort of, at the complete opposite end of that.
Yeah. Apple Vision Pro is an interesting one. There's a principle in marketing called MAIA, most advanced yet acceptable. And I think the interesting thing about Vision Pro is, have they got that balance right? So, I mean, would you use it as an example? I'm not necessarily saying you're the target audience, but can you see yourself using that Vision Pro?
I'm always up for trying things, but I am also skeptical of the price point of these things, of the first things, basically.
So I think the challenge Apple have got is contrast that with Ray-Ban Metas, right?
Yeah.
So what Meta have done is they've been through the Maya cycle, right? So what they realized is that they bought Oculus and they made basically the metaverse, right? It was a similar thing to Apple Pro. You put on a headset, you get an immersive experience. It was all very interactive, but it was a jump too far in technology. It just didn't feel like it is. So Maya stands for most advanced yet acceptable. So things can be too advanced for you to adopt them, right?
Yeah.
What they got right is they then did a collaboration with with Ray-Ban. And what they did with Ray-Ban, which was brilliant, is they designed glasses you want to wear. So they took the most common and most popular Ray-Bans and built the technology into that, so that you're wearing something you're used to wearing, but it's got a twist. So it's I can take photos. I can take a call. And actually, the technology has been dumbed down quite significantly. So, rather than kind of being a 3D kind of virtual world that you're kind of wandering around in, actually it's just integrated into your everyday life. So I think the challenge for Apple from a marketing perspective is they're asking their audience to do a lot. They're asking them to make a really big jump in technology. Whereas what Apple's really good at is taking something that we're familiar with, headphones or the iPad or the phone, and making it a bit more stylish, making it easier to use, making it more beautiful. So I think with Vision Pro, it's just too big a technology jump, I think, for most people to make.
That's interesting. And then Ryanair just seems to be increasingly rude to everyone.
I know. Ryanair is an amazing brand. I mean, people would be surprised for me to say this, like Ryanair, what brands, But the thing with Ryanair that people don't understand is they are consistent with who they are. So it doesn't matter what personality you are, but make sure you stick to your personality. If your personality of your brand is basically to give people only what they need and not what they want, and you specialize in the cheapest possible flight to Girona, but basically you have to slum it on the seats, you have to pay to go to the loo, you have to pay £5 for a glass of water, right? That is actually signalling. It's negative signalling, but it's signalling, right? It's reinforcing the fact that you're getting a very, very, very cheap seat. So them being rude on social media is completely consistent with the idea that they don't care about what you say about them on social media. You're getting a cheap flight. And that's why it's consistent. But imagine if BA, who, want to be the world's favorite airline, or that's certainly how we perceive them, if they're rude to you, everyone would have a meltdown.
Yeah.
But Ryanair built it in. It's a bit like why Boris got away with stuff, right? Boris could get away with so many things a normal politician couldn't, because it was part of his persona. It was part of what we expected him. We expected him to kind of, fluff his lines and do something stupid. And therefore he got forgiveness for
priced it. In, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's really, really interesting. On the sort of, I have this concept about mentors and so on, that we have mentoring wrong, and too much of it, we think of it as the sort of like person in the 50s mentoring someone in the 20s, whereas actually you kind of need somebody that's like a couple of years ahead of you, really, because the world is moving faster and like context and cultural stuff is changing. As somebody who's run a podcast for 7 years, and I've done it for 5 years, what are the metrics that you kind of now look at in terms of where would you like to be in a year's time, 2-3 years? How do you think about it? How do you sort of plan for it? What are the things you look for?
Yeah. I think the thing at the moment, what I'm thinking is how do I expand the footprint of the podcast? So the audience, I'm very fortunate to have a really high value audience. So the audience are typically senior marketers, founders of creative agencies, people who work in the media, right? So it's a really high value audience that spend a lot of money on a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
They also love to go to events and conferences. They love to get trained, they love to network and so on. So the way I'm thinking about the podcast is, what are the other things that could sit around the podcast that would create value, given that I've done the media job, right? I've done the job of creating a vehicle to reach and talk to them regularly every single week. What else can I do that then is consistent with the Uncensored CMO brand? So the thing I'm excited about really is what's the big annual conference that the very best, most creative people in the world, will come along to. What's the networking event that means that if you want a new job, I can connect you with the best marketers on the planet in just the kind of sector that you're thinking about. So I'm thinking more in terms of footprint than maybe what's next. Although I will continue experimenting with different formats of the show. One thing I'm looking at is the rest is model, right? So Uncensored, if Uncensored is the brand, Uncensored could mean more than a CMO. It could mean a founder. It could mean different channels like media, So the brand itself. So I was quite glad actually that I came up with a brand idea that's stretchy,
Yes.
So it's got kind of future, innovation built into it. I think just in terms of positioning.
Yeah, definitely. That is interesting. So it's thinking about the other sort of products around it and so on. And I guess that's the point, is like in the marketing space, everyone will have heard of you, right? There isn't going to be anyone that has, and if it is, it's probably their fault rather than yours by this stage, right?
Well, I would say in the UK, that is 100% true.
Yeah.
But back to your question, actually, sorry, what I should have also said, I've been, a really big pivot I made 18 months ago was 50%, at least 50% of my content was going to be in the US. Because actually, if you look at all the big British podcasts, they've all gone to America because the market is just 10x, right?
Yeah.
Everything is bigger. The money involved is a lot more. The influence you get is a lot greater. So, and this is hard yards for me, actually, to be honest, because it means we have to fly. Me and producer James fly. We take the studio with us. We have to go where the guest is. So it has a big consequence for travel, for time, for investment. But I can see it in the numbers though. So almost my entire growth now is coming from the US, and the US as a percentage of my listener base has doubled in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. So that's really exciting. But I have to remember the competition in the US is a lot greater. So again, in terms of the podcast, I've got to think, how do I make it different? How do I make it better? How do I expand the footprint in the US as well? So that all comes with like a ton of logistics and cost and everything else in it as well.
John, thank you very much for coming on Jimmy's Jobs of the Future.
Great, it's good to be here, man. Thank you for having me.